Keanu Reeves sat in a corner seat on the subway. His posture relaxed, but his senses quietly alert. A well-worn baseball cap cast a shadow over his recognizable face, while a faded hoodie obscured the rest of his features. Despite his worldwide fame, Keanu found solace in moments like this, moments where he could simply be another person, another body blending into the rhythm of the city. The metallic hum of the train, the faint creak of the carriage, and the mix of muted conversations and tired sighs created a symphony of urban life that grounded him. The train lurched to a stop, the jolt causing passengers to sway slightly as the doors opened with a mechanical hiss. A new wave of people shuffled into the already crowded car. Among them, a young man in a gray hoodie caught Keanu's attention almost immediately. His movements were quick and jerky, his sharp eyes darting around the car as though he were assessing his surroundings. There was something predatory in his energy, a kind of restless unease that made Keanu sit a little straighter. He'd encountered people like this before, people who were looking for trouble or an easy target. It didn't take long for the young man's eyes to lock onto his mark. Keanu followed his gaze and saw her. She was an elderly woman, likely in her 70s, who entered the subway car with deliberate care. Her frail hands clutched an oversized handbag against her chest, as if it held not just her possessions, but everything she had left in the world. Her hunched shoulders and slow, shuffling steps spoke of years of hardship. Her shoes, worn at the edges, scuffed against the floor as she scanned the car for an empty seat. Her name, Keanu would later learn, was Clara Rivers. Clara's eyes swept across the seated passengers, silently asking for a bit of kindness, a gesture as simple as someone offering her their seat. But no one moved. Some passengers avoided her gaze entirely, their eyes glued to their phones or fixed on some point outside the window. Others glanced at her briefly before looking away, their indifference sharp and cold. The small flicker of hope in her expression dimmed, replaced by a quiet resignation as she shuffled further into the car. Keanu felt a pang in his chest as he watched. The vulnerability etched into every line of Clara's face, the subtle tremble in her hands, and the effort it took for her to stay upright on the moving train all struck him deeply. He leaned forward slightly, ready to rise and offer his seat. But before he could act, the young man in the gray hoodie stepped toward her. For a fleeting moment, Keanu thought the young man was going to help her, but that hope was dashed when the man smirked and blocked Clara's path with an arrogant swagger. "Move it, Grandma," he sneered, his tone sharp and venomous. Clara froze, her confusion evident. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again, this time with more force. "I said move," he barked, giving her a slight shove with his shoulder. The train car seemed to hold its breath. A few passengers gasped, while others glanced away, unwilling to get involved. Keanu's hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of his hoodie. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he held back for the moment, his sharp eyes fixed on the scene. He wanted to see if anyone else would step up. Surely, out of the 20 or so people in the car, someone would, but no one did. Clara stumbled slightly, gripping a nearby pole for support. Her knuckles whitened as she tightened her hold on her bag. "Please," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I just want to sit down." The young man's grin widened. "What's in the bag? Grandma? Rocks? Dragging your whole house around? Huh?" He turned to the crowd as if expecting laughter. A few people chuckled nervously, while others raised their phones to record the scene. Clara's hands shook as she tried to hold her ground. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice breaking. The young man laughed, clearly enjoying the power he held over her. "Or what?" he taunted, stepping closer. In one swift motion, he snatched her bag and held it high above her reach. "What are you gonna do about it?" "Huh?" Clara gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "Please, give that back," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. She reached for the bag, but the young man pulled it away, dangling it just out of her reach like a cruel game. Keanu stood. It wasn't a rushed, panicked movement. It was calm, deliberate, and full of purpose. The atmosphere in the car shifted the moment he rose, like the air had grown heavier. The passengers who had been laughing or recording fell silent. their eyes turning to him. The young man, too caught up in his mockery, didn't notice at first. "That's enough," Keanu said, his voice low and steady but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. The young man turned, his cocky grin faltering slightly when he saw Keanu. "What's it to you, old man?" he spat, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his tone. Keanu took a step closer, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Give her the bag," he said simply. The young man hesitated, glancing around the car. The crowd's energy had shifted. No one was laughing now. The weight of Keanu's presence seemed to fill the space, pressing down on everyone. Even those who didn't recognize him could feel it, his quiet authority, his unshakable resolve. "Chill, man," the young man muttered, lowering the bag. "It's just a joke." Keanu didn't break eye contact. "Apologize," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young man looked around again, searching for support, but found none. His bravado crumbled. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Louder," Keanu demanded. "I'm sorry," the young man barked, his voice trembling with frustration. Keanu nodded. "Now sit down." The young man dropped into a seat, his head lowered in defeat. Keanu bent down, picked up Clara's bag, and handed it to her gently. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening as he met her teary gaze. Clara nodded, clutching her bag tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Keanu gave her a small nod, then turned back to his seat. As he sat down, the train rolled forward, the tension in the car gradually easing, but the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. In that moment, Keanu wasn't a celebrity, a movie star, or an icon. He was simply a man who had refused to look away. And to Clara, that made all the difference. Keanu's jaw tightened as he watched the unsettling scene play out before him. Clara, the frail elderly woman who had just entered the subway car, glanced around hesitantly, her hopeful eyes scanning for someone, anyone, willing to offer her a seat. Her grip tightened on the oversized handbag clutched to her chest, as though it were a shield against the cold indifference that surrounded her. But the passengers avoided her gaze. Some were absorbed in their phones, scrolling with an almost exaggerated focus. Others stared blankly out the window, pretending not to notice her at all. The quiet rejection etched lines of disappointment deeper into Clara's tired face. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of their apathy pressing down on her like an invisible burden. Keanu shifted in his seat, frustration stirring within him. He had witnessed this kind of behavior before, the quiet complicity of people too absorbed in their own lives to extend even the smallest act of kindness. He thought about standing up, about giving Clara his seat. But before he could move, a young man in a gray hoodie stepped forward. For a brief moment, Keanu's hope was rekindled. Perhaps this young man would be the one to do the right thing. But that hope was shattered as soon as the young man sneered, his voice sharp and full of disdain. "Move it, Grandma," he barked, his tone laced with cruel amusement. Clara froze, startled by his harsh words. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice quiet and uncertain. The young man's grin widened, his body language radiating arrogance. He stepped to block her path as she tried to sidestep him. "I said, move," he repeated, the mockery in his tone unmistakable. Clara flinched as he leaned toward her slightly, his presence intimidating. She clutched the metal pole next to her for support, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. The shove that followed wasn't forceful, but it didn't need to be. The act itself was enough to send Clara stumbling back a step, her fragile frame swaying unsteadily. A few gasps rippled through the car as the passengers who had been ignoring her suddenly took notice of the confrontation. Keanu's fingers twitched as he gripped the edge of his seat. His sharp eyes stayed locked on the young man. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He felt the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge in the young man's behavior. Keanu's heart beat faster, but he remained seated, watching and waiting, hoping that someone else might intervene. The young man turned to the passengers, his grin stretching wider as if he were performing on a stage. "Look at this old bag," he said loudly, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. dragging her whole house around in that ugly purse. What's in there? Grandma? Rocks. A couple of people chuckled nervously, though their laughter was tinged with discomfort. Others remained silent, their eyes darting between the young man and Clara but refusing to make eye contact. A few phones appeared in people's hands, cameras recording the scene with detached fascination, as though it were a spectacle rather than a real moment of cruelty. Clara lowered her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She tried once more to move past him, her steps hesitant and shaky. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I just want to sit down." But the young man wasn't finished. He stepped in front of her again, blocking her path with a mocking chuckle. "Where do you think you're going? Huh? You deaf or something? Grandma? I'm talking to you." Clara didn't respond this time. She tightened her grip on her bag, her knuckles whitening as she held on as if her life depended on it. But the young man was relentless. With a quick, deliberate motion, he snatched the handbag from her hands and held it high above her reach. The bag dropped to the floor with a loud thud, and Clara let out a startled cry. "Give that back," she pleaded, her voice trembling with desperation. She reached for the bag, but the young man stepped back, swinging it playfully like a prize he'd just won. Keanu's grip on the edge of his seat tightened further, his knuckles turning white, his pulse quickened, his instinct screaming at him to stand up, to act. But still, he hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the other passengers. Surely someone else would step forward, someone among the 20 or so people in the car. But no one did. A man in a suit sitting near the front of the car shifted uncomfortably but made no move to help. A teenage boy with headphones on glanced up briefly before returning his attention to his phone. A woman near the back of the car muttered something under her breath but quickly looked away, avoiding the scene entirely. Keanu felt a wave of disgust, not just for the young man, but for the collective inaction of the passengers. Every second that passed felt heavier, the silence in the car growing louder and more suffocating. He realized, in that moment, that waiting for someone else to act was no longer an option. With a steady breath, Keanu rose from his seat. The movement was calm, deliberate, and purposeful, but it carried the weight of a storm. The atmosphere in the car shifted instantly. The nervous laughter stopped. The passengers with their phones lowered them slightly, their attention now fixed on him. Even the young man seemed to sense the change, his grin faltering for the first time as he turned to face Keanu. "That's enough," Keanu said, his voice low and steady, but carrying an undeniable authority that silenced the entire car. The young man blinked, his bravado wavering as he took a step back. "What's it to you, old man?" he shot back, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments ago. Keanu took another step forward, his calm gaze locked on the young man. "Give her the bag," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The young man hesitated, his eyes darting around the car in search of an ally, but there were none. The passengers who had ignored Clara moments earlier now sat frozen, their eyes wide as they watched the confrontation unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, the energy in the car shifting entirely. And as Keanu stood there, unyielding and resolute, it was clear to everyone that the power dynamic had changed. The young man smirked, swinging the handbag mockingly as if it were a prize he'd just won. "What's in here, Grandma?" he jeered, his voice loud enough to command the attention of the entire car. "Your life savings? Rocks? Maybe some knitting supplies?" He laughed, turning his head to the other passengers as if he were delivering a comedy routine on stage. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the car, but most people stayed silent, their faces blank, eyes glued to their phones or the floor, pretending not to see. Clara stood frozen, her trembling hands still outstretched toward the bag she'd just lost. Her face was pale, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She tried to step closer, her movements slow and hesitant, but the young man raised the bag higher, well out of her reach, his grin widening as he sneered. "What's the rush, Grandma? You're not going anywhere." She took another step forward, her voice quivering. "Please, that's mine. Give it back." The young man ignored her, his attention turning to the few passengers who were still watching. "Man, she's really dragging her whole house around in this thing," he said with a dramatic laugh, shaking the bag for emphasis. She's lucky her back didn't break carrying it. Clara's shoulders slumped as though the weight of the ridicule bore down on her more than the loss of the bag. She reached out again, desperation in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I need it." But her plea only seemed to fuel his cruelty. He took a step back and shoved her lightly with his free hand. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough to make her stumble into the nearest pole, her frail body jerking from the impact. The thud of her handbag hitting the floor earlier had been loud, but the sound of her gasp as she tried to steady herself was louder in Keanu's mind. It was the sound that finally broke his silence. Keanu's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He had been watching closely from his seat, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, waiting for the right moment to act. His sharp eyes scanned the car, taking in the faces of the other passengers. Some were still recording, their phones held up as if this were some kind of live entertainment. Others looked away, avoiding the scene altogether. No one moved. No one intervened. The suffocating tension in the car pressed against him, urging him to act. Keanu took a slow, deliberate breath, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of what he knew he had to do. He couldn't stay silent any longer. This had gone far enough. With deliberate movements, Keanu stood up from his seat. His presence, though quiet, commanded attention. He wasn't rushed, nor did he make a scene, but there was an unmistakable authority in the way he carried himself. It was as though the entire atmosphere in the car shifted with his rise. The nervous chuckles faded, the murmur of whispers died, and the focus shifted from the young man to him. The young man, too engrossed in his own amusement, didn't notice Keanu's approach at first. He swung the bag lazily, his grin unwavering as he teased. "What's the matter, Grandma? Cat got your tongue." But Keanu's shadow fell over him, and the young man froze. Slowly, he turned, his smirk faltering as his eyes landed on Keanu. There was no mistaking the calm yet intense look in his eyes. Keanu didn't need to say anything right away. His presence alone was enough to unnerve the young man. The car went silent. Even the faint hum of the subway tracks seemed distant. "That's enough," Keanu said, his voice low but firm. There was no need to shout. His tone carried more weight than volume ever could. The young man blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He tried to laugh it off, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his unease. "What's it to you, old man?" he sneered, though the confidence that had fueled his earlier antics was quickly draining. "You got a problem?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Give her the bag," he said, his tone steady, unyielding. The young man hesitated, glancing around the car as if searching for support. But the same passengers who had laughed nervously at his jokes were now silent, their phones lowered, their eyes averted. There was no one left to back him up. "Listen, man, I was just joking," the young man said, holding the bag out slightly but not yet surrendering it. "It's not that deep." Keanu took another step closer, his eyes never leaving the young man's. "Give it back," he repeated, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "Now." The young man swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under Keanu's unwavering stare. Finally, he lowered the bag, placing it on the floor in front of Clara. "Here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu didn't break eye contact. "Apologize," he said, his tone just as firm. "What?" the young man said, his head snapping up. "You heard me," Keanu replied. "Apologize." The young man's face twisted in frustration, but the tension in the car and the weight of Keanu's gaze left him no choice. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely audible. "Louder," Keanu said, his voice sharp. "I said, I'm sorry," the young man barked, throwing his hands up. Clara bent down slowly, retrieving her bag with trembling hands. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched it close to her chest. She looked at Keanu, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." Keanu nodded, the intensity in his eyes softening as he glanced at her. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The young man stepped back, defeated, and the car seemed to exhale collectively as the tension broke. Keanu stayed standing for a moment longer, his sharp gaze ensuring the young man wouldn't try anything else. The subway car's metal walls seemed to hum in relief, as though even they had been holding their breath. As the train rattled toward the next station, the passengers who had once been silent now seemed to carry a quiet sense of shame. And though no one spoke, the message was clear. One man's courage had shifted the balance, reminding them all of the power of doing what's right. "That's enough," Keanu said, his voice steady and firm, cutting through the tension in the subway car like a knife. The sound was not loud, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. The young man spun around, his expression momentarily uncertain before his usual bravado kicked back in. He squared his shoulders, sneering as he tried to reclaim the upper hand. "Who do you think you are, old man?" he shot back, his tone laced with defiance. Keanu took a step forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The fluorescent light overhead flickered slightly, casting just enough of a glow on his face for recognition to ripple through the car. A faint murmur began among the passengers, whispers spreading like wildfire. "Wait, is that Keanu Reeves?" The boy's cocky grin wavered as the atmosphere shifted. The room no longer felt like his playground, and the quiet strength radiating from Keanu was impossible to ignore. The older man's calm, composed demeanor carried more weight than any loud confrontation ever could. "Put it down," Keanu said, his voice colder now, each word pronounced with the kind of clarity that left no room for argument. He didn't need to raise his voice. The authority in his tone was enough. The young man hesitated, his eyes darting around the car, searching for allies. But the faces that had been entertained moments ago now turned away, their laughter silenced, their gazes averted. The phones that had been eagerly recording the drama were suddenly lowered, as though the sheer gravity of Keanu's presence had cast a shadow over the spectacle. Realizing the crowd wouldn't back him up, the boy's confidence crumbled. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he bent down and placed the bag on the floor at Clara's feet. "Chill, man. It's just a joke," he muttered, his voice losing its edge as he tried to save face. Keanu didn't move, his piercing gaze never leaving the young man. "Apologize," he said, his voice steady but unyielding. The boy glanced up, confusion and resistance flashing across his face. "What?" he asked, his bravado flaring one last time. "You heard me," Keanu said, his tone sharp and deliberate, as though he was cutting through the young man's pride with each syllable. "Apologize to her." For a moment, the boy hesitated, his jaw tightening. He looked around again, perhaps hoping for even a shred of validation. But there was none. The silent disapproval of the passengers hung heavy in the air, and the young man could feel it pressing down on him. Defeated, he turned to Clara, his voice barely a whisper. "Sorry." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "Louder," he demanded, his calm demeanor now laced with steel. The boy exhaled sharply, his frustration evident as he raised his voice. "I said I'm sorry." "All right," he barked, throwing up his hands in exasperation. Clara, who had been clutching her handbag tightly against her chest, nodded slightly. Her trembling hands loosened their grip, and though her voice wavered with emotion, she managed to quiet. "Thank you." Keanu's gaze softened as he turned to her, his expression calm and reassuring. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded again, her lips trembling as she fought back tears. "Yes, thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Keanu stepped back, the tension in his shoulders easing, though his eyes flicked to the young man one last time, a silent warning in his gaze. The boy, now utterly defeated, slumped into a corner seat, his bravado extinguished. The atmosphere in the subway car shifted again. The oppressive tension that had filled the space moments ago began to lift, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Passengers who had once been passive observers now seemed to carry an air of quiet shame. Some fidgeted with their phones, while others kept their eyes down, unwilling to meet Keanu's gaze. The subway jolted as it began to slow for the next station. The intercom crackled, announcing the stop in a monotone voice. Keanu glanced at Clara once more, ensuring she was steady on her feet. Her fragile frame seemed stronger now, bolstered by the simple act of someone standing up for her. As the doors hissed open, Keanu stepped aside to let passengers exit. Clara gave him a small, grateful smile, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You don't have to," Keanu replied, his tone gentle. "Just take care of yourself." She nodded, clutching her bag tightly as she found a seat. Keanu lingered near the door, his presence still commanding, ensuring that the young man wouldn't try anything else before the train resumed its journey. The boy kept his head down, avoiding Keanu's gaze entirely. As the subway doors slid shut and the train rattled forward once more, Keanu returned to his seat. He leaned back, pulling his hood lower over his face, retreating once again into the anonymity he had started the journey with. But this time, the weight on his shoulders felt different, not heavier, but steadier, as if he had carried something important and set it down in the right place. The other passengers stole glances at him, their faces a mixture of curiosity, recognition, and quiet respect. Though no words were exchanged, the message was clear. Keanu Reeves had reminded them all of something they had forgotten: that courage doesn't always come from the loudest voices, and kindness doesn't always need a spotlight. Sometimes, it's the quiet acts that leave the deepest impact. "What?" the boy stammered, his arrogance faltering under the weight of the moment. "Apologize," Keanu repeated, his tone calm but with an edge that left no room for argument. His eyes bore into the young man, unwavering, commanding respect in a way that words alone couldn't convey. The boy shifted uneasily, his shoulders sagging as he cast a reluctant glance at Clara. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely louder than a whisper. "Louder," Keanu said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The boy's face twisted in frustration as he barked. "I'm sorry." He threw up his hands in defeat. The fight drained from him. He crouched down, picking up Clara's bag with a jerky motion and holding it out toward her, as though it burned to touch. Clara hesitated for a moment, her trembling hands finally reaching for the bag. She clutched it tightly to her chest, her fingers gripping the worn leather like a lifeline. Her eyes welled with tears, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she looked up at Keanu. Keanu gave her a small nod, his expression softening for just a moment. Then, turning back to the boy, his tone shifted again, regaining its firm, authoritative edge. "Now, sit down," he ordered. The boy slumped into an empty seat without protest, his earlier bravado shattered. His gaze fell to the floor, avoiding the stares of the other passengers, who now regarded him with a mixture of contempt and unease. The train screeched to a stop at the next station, the doors hissing open. The sound of boots on the platform echoed as two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately commanding attention. They had been alerted by calls from several passengers, and their sharp eyes scanned the car for the source of the disturbance. Keanu stepped forward, calm and composed, and explained the situation in precise, measured words. His voice was steady, his demeanor unflinching as he detailed what had happened. The officers nodded, their expressions grim, and approached the young man, who had gone pale and stiff in his seat. "All right, on your feet," one officer said sternly, gesturing for the boy to stand. "I didn't do anything," the boy protested weakly, his voice lacking the confidence he had displayed earlier. "Tell it to the judge," the officer snapped, grabbing his arm and pulling him up. The metallic clink of handcuffs echoed through the car, a sharp reminder of the consequences of his actions. As the officers escorted the boy off the train, Keanu's gaze followed them, his face unreadable. The tension in the subway car began to dissipate, replaced by a heavy silence. Clara finally sank into a seat, her body visibly relaxing as she held her bag tightly against her chest. She looked at Keanu, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and disbelief. Her voice was soft, almost trembling, as she said, "You didn't have to do that." Keanu turned toward her, his expression gentle but firm. "Yes, I did," he replied. "No one should have to go through that alone." Clara's lips quivered as she nodded, her gaze falling to her back. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Keanu gave her a faint smile, one that carried both reassurance and humility. "You don't need to thank me," he said simply. "Just take care of yourself." Around them, the other passengers began to stir, some shifting in their seats, others glancing at Keanu with newfound respect. A few looked ashamed, their earlier inaction weighing heavily on them now. One by one, the phones that had captured the scene were lowered, and murmurs of admiration rippled through the car. The train began to move again, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filling the space with a sense of finality. Keanu returned to his seat, pulling his hood up and leaning back against the window. Though his posture was relaxed, his mind was still processing what had just happened. Across from him, Clara sat quietly, her grip on her bag loosening as her breathing steadied. She glanced at Keanu once more, her eyes brimming with unspoken gratitude. He met her gaze and nodded,